Hi, Joe here from SHUTTERSPEAK Photography. Very nice to see your smiling face again here on YouTube. Hey, so welcome to my Luminar HDR Merge class. In this class, I'm going to teach you a lot about how to use the HDR Merge function of Luminar Neo. It's finally reached a point where it is definitely a replacement to Aurora. Aurora was absolutely my all-time favorite HDR program. So, hey, I'm going to explain to you in this course what HDR or high dynamic range photography is, why you would want to use it, when you would want to use it, and also when you shouldn't. Now, HDR photography is the perfect solution for capturing amazing images of cityscapes, inside churches or cathedrals, landscapes, at sunrise, at sunset, and especially it's a staple of real estate photography. Okay, or just about really any nighttime scene where there's bright lights and you want to capture those bright lights without losing detail. Now, that doesn't apply to stars. Bright lights, I'm talking about like cityscapes or installations of like art or things like that where there's a lot of bright light illuminating a structure at night. Okay, so I've even used it to capture live music. So in live music, I've used HDR to grab the stage, the video monitors that were up on either side of the stage, you know, the bright lights coming down and the crowd. So you can really get just amazing images using HDR photography. Okay, you're going to walk away with images that you would have never thought would have been possible in a single photo. Now, I know when HDR first came out, it kind of got a bad rap. Okay, the reason for that was it was overused, it was misused, it was used incorrectly, it was overdone. The list goes on, right? But if we understand what HDR photography is and when to use it, we can avoid those errors and of course we're not going to overdo things, right? So we're going to avoid these mistakes and we're going to, have you, by the end of this, understand when to use it to get those images that are just going to wow and amaze your friends when you share these images, okay? So, like I mentioned in the past, if you would ask me what would be my go-to HDR software, I would have told you every time, blending my HDR images together, I would have told you Aurora by Skylum. Hands down, the best HDR program to work with. But with the latest updates to Neo and the HDR Merge plugin, okay, they've created a really simple to use workflow where you can go from programs like Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop right into Neo to do your HDR Merge, or you can use it directly from Luminar Neo itself. And this has now become my personal favorite workflow. So for me, my personal favorite way of doing this is to bring my images into Lightroom, choose the ones that I want to merge to HDR, and I use Luminar Neo using the HDR Merge function as a plugin for Lightroom. I do all my HDR work in Neo, and then when I'm done, I just have to hit apply, and that brings the photo back into Lightroom. Okay, so let's get started. So this class is going to be broken down into different segments, so you'll be able to skip sections that you think maybe you don't need or you understand, and easily replay these sections that you need to go back over if you need to relearn a topic. Okay, so really the very first and most important thing that we need to understand is what exactly is HDR photography. Now, why is this important? Because when you understand what something is, you can understand why you would want to use it. And when you understand why, you're also going to understand when. So this is really crucial because people ask me all the time, like, when would I use HDR? So understanding this part is crucial. Okay, so let's get started with what exactly HDR is. Okay, HDR, as I mentioned, stands for High Dynamic Range Photography. So what the heck does that mean? Well, quite simply, it's the difference between the highlights, or the bright parts of the image that you're trying to capture, and the shadows, or the dark parts of the image that you are trying to capture. Okay, so when the difference is so great that the camera's sensor cannot capture it all in one photograph, and some of the details, like the highlights or shadows or both, are going to be lost, that's when high dynamic range photography as a technique comes into play. Okay, so by taking multiple photographs, some exposing for the bright parts of an image, some exposing for the mid-range, and some capturing the shadows or your dark areas, we can combine or blend these images together later and bring a scene to life in a way that you were actually able to see with your human eye when you were there. Okay, so that being said, it's important to realize the human eye has vastly more dynamic range than your camera sensor does. So when you're standing someplace looking at something, there's a lot of different things going on. First off, your eye is constantly adjusting. Your pupil is dilating and contracting depending on where you look. If you look into a shadow region on the fly, your eyes are dilating, and so you can see deeper into that shadow area, or contracting if you're looking at something bright, right? This is happening almost instantaneously. The camera, while it can do that, it can't continuously do it. It can only do it once the moment you take a picture, right? So that's something important to realize. Okay, so well, what exactly does that mean for us? Okay, well, exactly what it means is that your camera sensor, what it's going to do is it's going to try to expose for as much dynamic range as it's capable of, knowing it's going to sacrifice some of the highlights and some of the shadows. Okay, so wherever that dynamic range of your camera's sensor is exceeded, that information is what we call clipped. Okay, so what happens is when your camera clips data, well, that simply means it's lost. Okay, for example, when the highlights of your camera's sensor exceed what it's able to capture, it's going to go to pure white. Once you reach pure white, all of that detail is lost. The same applies to the shadows, but in reverse. So when the shadows are too dark for your camera sensor to resolve that information, it goes to pure black. Once that happens, again, all of the information, the detail, is lost, okay, or clipped. Okay, so we can expand your camera's dynamic range by using HDR. So the first question, and the most important, is, well, how do I know when to use HDR photography? Well, one of the simplest ways to know when to use HDR photography is to take a look at the histogram of your camera. Okay? HDR works great when the difference between the highlights and the shadows are very great. The inside of a cathedral or a cityscape, like I mentioned earlier, where you want to capture, like let's say inside a cathedral, the bright stained glass windows, but yet the dark shadows of the opening of the cathedral leading up to the altar. So you have very vast differences in light in a cathedral, especially in daylight, where those stained glass windows are going to be very bright, but the inside of the cathedral is going to be very dark. Okay, that's generally going to be a difference in brights to darks that are going to exceed the ability of your camera to capture all of that information. So that's a great time to use it. And again, just taking a look at the histogram of your camera is going to help you. If you see information in your histogram that's shifted all the way over to the left, that means that you're losing data in the darks. If your histogram is shifted all the way to the right, that means you're losing information in the bright areas. And it might be all the way across where you're touching both the left end and the right end and losing some shadows and some highlights. So when you see that in the histogram of your camera, that's when you know, hey, this is a great scene to use HDR for. All right, so when should I not use HDR? Okay, that's just as important as when to use it, okay? So today's modern cameras have incredible dynamic range. The Nikon Z7 II, for example, can expose 14.7 EVs, or exposure values of light. That gives the camera pretty incredible dynamic range. Still, it pales in comparison to what your eye can see. However, given such great dynamic range in our modern cameras, it does mean that we're going to use the HDR technique less often. Okay, so typically images shot outside in daylight or any light source that's not significantly brighter or darker in any particular areas do not need the HDR technique. So typically daytime landscapes, seldom if ever will you need HDR in a daytime landscape if you're using any fairly recent high-end digital camera. Okay, and that includes your Sonys, your Canons, your Nikons, your Fujis. If it has really, really strong dynamic range, and you should know, try and know what your dynamic range of your camera is, look it up if you're not sure. But if it's in that like 14 EV range, you know, even 12, 13, 14 EVs, pretty much a daytime, you just do not need to use this technique. It's not going to benefit you in any way. All right, so I want to show you this image. This image is one single shot straight up in the daytime, taken on my Nikon Z camera. Again, about 14.7 or so EVs of dynamic range on that camera body. And if we take a look at the histogram here in Luminar Neo, you will see that we have no clipping, so there's no information that's touching this far side here in the shadows. So we have all of the shadow detail. And you see there's just a tiny, tiny bit of information that is clipping over here on the right side. So those are our highlights. And if you see these little circles, as we mouse over the histogram, you'll see a little circle appear. If you click on that circle, it's going to show you what is clipped. So this information here was a little bit overexposed for the camera, but so there is maybe a little bit of a loss of detail. It's going to pure white, but I'm not overly concerned with that because it's clouds and they're white and fluffy anyway. So I think overall HDR was not needed in this photo. So let me show you what can be done with just a few quick edits. Now I'm not going to edit it. I've already just done it quick. That way I can show you exactly what has been done. And you see now with just a few clicks, and I'll show you the edits that I've done here on the Edits tab. Didn't touch the exposure, just a little bit of smart contrast. Brought the highlights down to -10, shadows up to 78. And you can see at the histogram now we have no clipping anymore. So this actually came back. And you see all the detail that's now back in that cloud area. And I also did use Enhance AI. So I used Enhance and Sky, Accent AI and Sky Enhancer AI. Okay, but you can see how all the data came back. So we're good on both sides here. Okay, and we were able to get all of the detail on it, and I can continue to work this image, and I particularly would probably work on the statue here and bring those levels up and maybe crop it a little bit. But if I had done extra frames here to do HDR photography, taken extra frames for the shadows and the highlights, it would not have helped me. First off, I didn't need any extra frames for the shadows because we could see in the histogram, we had all of them. And the amount of data that we lost in the highlight end was so minimal that Neo was able to bring this photograph back perfectly. So straight up broad daylight, very even lighting, HDR technique is not going to help us. Okay, so here's another example. We are using the histogram on the back of the camera to take a look at the scene. Now you can see from the image here that there is no clipping either to the left or to the right. So if we were to take just one single shot we're going to do perfectly fine with this image. We're going to have the sky, we're going to have the water, we're going to have everything in perfect exposure. So this is a great example of using the histogram on your camera to determine whether or not you need to use HDR photography. Okay, so I have this photograph inside the incredibly beautiful Cathedral of Incarnation. It's located in Garden City, New York, one of the most beautiful cathedrals in New York, in my opinion. And this is the straight up one-shot photo. And you can see, just by looking at the histogram, we've lost a ton of information here in the shadow area. Okay, so when we look at that, you can see that that's very obvious. These stained glass windows are blown out. These lights are blown out. And there's just a lot of loss of detail up in these shadow areas. So I took 7 shots going to -3 EVs, -2 EVs, -1, this regular normal photo, and then a +1 and a +2, I believe. So let's take a look at what those look like. Okay, oops, I'm sorry. Let's go to catalog. And here we are. This is the -3 EV shot. And you really see we're just getting the stained glass and these lights. And that's all that we're getting in here. And that's okay. Then the -2 captures a little bit more of the detail in here and more of that stained glass. And now we're at -1. And now this is starting to fill in these shadow areas. And as we go up now, +1, you see the shadow areas filling in with detail. +2, all these areas in here starting to fill in with detail. And then actually did a +3, which fills in even more detail. So when we merge these together, what do we get? Well, let's take a look. Okay, so here is the result of our blended photo, and you can see now we've captured beautifully all of the stained glass in here. Look at these stained glass windows. The lights are perfect. We have all of the detail up here in the shadows and the pews. So it's a beautifully blended HDR photograph that we could have never captured in a single shot. So this is the magic of HDR, enabling us to capture this image the way it would have looked for us when we were there. And of course we can play around with this and edit this to our heart's content to make it however moody or bright or light and airy or whatever it is we want it to feel. But again, it's just that ability to capture all of these nice little highlights here. Let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at the stained glass windows. You see the detail in all of those windows back there here along the sides. And again, look at these lights perfectly exposed. We could have never done this in a single image. So that's the magic of HDR, and this is why it's a technique you need to be familiar with and you need to use it. So one of the things that it's important to touch base on is how do you take HDR photos? Well, almost all cameras have an auto bracketing function built into them, and I can't really show you how to do it because there's so many different cameras out there. I do have videos on how to do it on your Nikon Z camera that you can watch if you're a Nikon user, but every camera is going to be slightly different. But the bottom line is this, a few tips. You want to do it in aperture priority mode. You want to have auto ISO off, okay? And what's going to happen is you're going to pick the aperture that you want to shoot at and the ISO that you want to shoot at. Generally, you're going to want to do this on a tripod, but you could do it handheld as well if you didn't have a tripod, as long as your shutter speed and your ISO is fast enough to compensate. So the bracketing is what the bracketing function of your camera does is you tell it how many shots you want to take and the increment in exposure values between each shot. Typically, it's 3 shots that are taken with an exposure value of 2 in between each one. So you would take a photograph that is normally exposed, a photograph that it's 2 stops underexposed, and then a photograph that's 2 stops overexposed using your camera's auto exposure bracketing function. Aperture priority mode is very important because you want the depth of field to be consistent in between each and every photo. You don't want that to change in between photos. So definitely use aperture priority mode, and if you can keep your ISO, if you're not going handheld and if you're on a tripod, auto ISO off, you could set it to your lowest ISO if you wanted to, because if you're on a tripod, you have the time because the camera's not going to shake or move. And if you're doing scenery and the subject isn't moving, you don't need to worry much about ISO. If it takes 10 seconds for it to expose a picture, that's fine, as long as you're on that tripod. Okay, so that's how you're going to set it up with your camera equipment. And again, I have videos for that if you're not sure how to do it, if you're a Nikon user. And there are plenty of videos out there from your camera manufacturers or in your camera documentation that'll teach you how to do auto exposure bracketing. I definitely, by the way, recommend using RAW, shooting in RAW, by the way, when you do this as well, to have as much image data captured as possible so that the software can blend the images, giving you the best possible results. Okay, so this wraps up part 1 of our Luminar Neo HDR Merge introduction. In part 2, coming up next, you're going to learn how to actually merge your bracketed photos together within Luminar Neo using the HDR Merge plugin. And we're going to go through a bunch of the settings and some of the pitfalls and the ways you can avoid them by adjusting the settings within that plugin. So I appreciate you. Thanks for watching. And as always, please do me a favor. If anything in this video has helped you out, please help me out by hitting like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you get notified of future updates on the channel. And by all means, leave me a comment. If you follow the channel, you know I do answer a lot of comments, and I always appreciate getting feedback from you guys. So, hey, thanks for watching, and I will see you in part 2. Thanks. Bye-bye.